everyone, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. I'm Amy Johnson-Crow, and this week we are going to be talking about what are you missing in the 1900 and 1910 censuses. They're both really great resources, and there's so much information in there that it's easy to miss some of it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Some of that great information that you might have overlooked, and also some ways that we can use these two censuses together to get a more complete picture of the household. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, a lot of people refer to the 1900 and 1910 censuses as being the high points of the U.S. Census. There's so much detailed information contained in it. And as I mentioned a moment ago, these two censuses work well together to give a more complete picture of the household, as well as giving us additional clues for where we can look for more records. Now, the header, the top portion of the 1900 and 1910 censuses are very similar. Over here on the left, we see the information about the county and the state where this census took place. The middle section gives us more specific information, the township or the city, and also the date that these households were enumerated. In the 1900 census, you will also see the name of the enumerator here in this middle part of the header. Now, moving over to the right-hand portion of this header is where we will find what's known as the supervisor's district and the enumeration district numbers. These are going to be important when you want to find these censuses later. Or let's say that you're looking at someone else's research and they mentioned that they found this household in the census of Cook County, Illinois, in Enumeration District 2. Well, that's what we have here, Enumeration District 2. It was a way to take a large section of, say, a city or a township and divide it up between the different census takers, between the different enumerators. So those are the numbers that we see here, along with the sheet number. So again, these are going to be the numbers that you will want to pay attention to when you go to cite your source later. And then a little difference here on the 1910 census, the name of the enumerator is over here on the right, compared to in 1900 when it was right there in the middle. So again, it's the same type of information that we're seeing in this header in both 1900 and 1910. Another area where 1900 and 1910 are very similar is along the left side of the page. And sometimes we skip this left-hand section because we want to get over here to this part. We want to get over here to the names. But over here on the left-hand section of 1900 and 1910, we see first a column for the street name. Now, if you're working in a rural area, it's not unusual at all to not see the name of the street or the name of the road. That was often left out in rural areas. The same for the house number, which is this first column of numbers. It's the actual street address. So here we have 81, and it looks like Isa Avenue. So here we have 81 Isa Avenue, 79, 77. These are the actual house numbers. Now the next two columns are numbers that helped the Census Bureau keep track of the families, keep track to make sure that they had accounted for all of the houses and all of the households. This middle column of numbers refers to the household number. Or refers to the dwelling number, actually, is how they defined it. So it would be just a sequential numbering of the houses that the census taker had visited. It doesn't tie in with their street address. It's just, you know, here was the 571st house that the census taker stopped at. Here's the 572nd, the 573rd. The last column of numbers is the family number. And it's important because you will see in some households, in some dwellings, that there will be multiple families in one household. So this was the Census Bureau's way of accounting for different households when they go to compile their statistics. So you could have one dwelling, one household with several families. And that's what these numbers are referring to. Now let's take a look specifically at the 1900 census. Now the first part of the 1900 census that we're going to take a look at is going to give us information about relationships, and specifically the relationship to the head of household. The person's color or race, their sex, their month and year of birth, and yes, you are reading that right, their age, marital status, the number of years they've been married, and for women, the number of children that they've had and the number that are still living. So let's take a closer look at this section of the 1900 census. And specifically what we're talking about is this section right here. After we get past the street name, the house number, the dwelling, and the family number. Take a closer look, and we have the person's name, and it's generally given as last name first. The next column is going to tell us that person's relationship to the head of the household. The next column is going to tell us, as defined here, color or race, the person's sex, and the next two columns gives us the month and year that the person was born. Now remember, this information is only going to be as accurate as the person who was talking to the census taker. The next column related to that is the person's age. Marital status, whether they were single, married, widowed, or divorced. The column after that is going to talk about the number of years married. And I wanted to point out this particular one where Nellie Ross is reporting that she's widowed and it says 22 years married, but it's been crossed out. The number of years married was only supposed to be recorded if the couple was currently married. Well, you can almost imagine if she's the one talking to the census taker and he says, you know, what's your marital status? She'll say, widowed, I was married for 22 years. And he went ahead and recorded it. Well, they crossed it out later because that information shouldn't have been recorded since she was widowed. And then the last two columns in this section referred to how many children a woman had had and how many of those children were still living. And we're not talking about minor children, we're talking about all of her children. So, even if a woman is in her 80s or 90s, it's going to record how many children she has had and how many of those children are still living. It's a great way to be able to reconstruct a family. The next section of the 1900 census, the next section will talk about the person's birthplace, their parents' birthplaces, as well as some questions about citizenship. And that's this middle section here. So here we have the person's birthplace, father's birthplace, and mother's birthplace. And for citizenship, they're asking questions about the year that the person immigrated to the United States, how many years they've been in the United States, and then a question about naturalization. Now, you'll see different values here in this naturalization column. You could see AL, like we have down here, This was an abbreviation that they used for alien, meaning that the citizenship process had not started. Sometimes you will see NA or NAT, which means that the person was naturalized. They had started and completed that naturalization process. This person was a naturalized U.S. citizen. Sometimes you'll see a notation for PA, and that was an abbreviation for first papers had been filed, also referred to as a declaration of intent. So they had started the naturalization process, but they had not yet completed it. So we see sort of three stages of citizenship. So we have people who are marked as aliens, the citizenship process had not started, people who were naturalized citizens, and then the people who were somewhere in the middle, that they had started the process, but it wasn't yet complete. And then the last section that we see of the 1900 census is going to cover occupation, education, and home ownership. And that's this very last section here on the right. Let's zoom in a little bit so we can see where they list the person's occupation. There's a column for number of months not employed. So this person down here at the bottom had actually not been employed for 6 months. Questions about education. Had they attended school? And if so, how many months in the last year have they attended school? Could they read? Could they write? And could they speak English? And then the very last section talking about home ownership. First, we'll ask if their home was owned or rented. And that will just be abbreviated as we see down here at the bottom. If I can get my cursor back, there we go. This person here is renting their home. Now, if they had owned their home, this next column asked if it was owned free or if it was mortgaged. The next column asks if it was a farm or a house. And if it was a farm, it would note what number on the farm schedule it would be. Now, that's kind of a moot point for us researching now because the farm schedules for 1900 no longer exist. So a little bit of information that, we can see that there would have been more things for us to look at, but unfortunately, those farm schedules no longer exist and we can't use them anymore. So that's an overview of the 1900 census. As I said, a lot of information contained in this record. Let's look at 1910. Very similar questions asked at the beginning of the 1910 census. Relationship to head of household, the sex, the color or race, age, marital status, and number of marriage, number of years married, and the number of children and the number still living. So let's take a look at the 1910 census. Again, we're going to look first at this section just past where we have the house number, the family number, and the dwelling number. So that good information, we have their names, and again, almost always listed as last name first. Relationship to the head of household. The person's sex, their color or race, age at last birthday. So we've lost some of that wonderful information that we had in 1900, which gave us a month and year of birth. Now we're back to just the age. But what we gain in 1910, along with the marital status, they were supposed to record what number of marriage it was. So here we have Carl Anderson, who's married, and this is his first marriage. The same with his wife, Hilda, married, and it's also her first marriage. This couple has been married for 10 years. And as we see for Hilda, she has had 2 children, both of whom are still living. Moving on to the next section of 1910, again, we see birthplace, parents' birthplaces, citizenship, And now a question about language being spoken. The neat thing about the US Census is not only does it tell us about the people living in the United States at the time, but just looking at the questions tells us what was important. We're starting to see in 1900 and by 1910 especially, we're starting to see a change in the demographics of the United States. And we're starting to see a lot more people coming in who didn't necessarily speak English. So this was an important question in 1910. So we're starting to see differences in what the government thought was important to keep track of. And that's reflected here in this question about language being spoken. So moving on to this next section of 1910. So we have the person's birthplace, the birthplace of the father, the birthplace of their mother. And again, questions about citizenship, just like we saw in 1900. When did they come to the United States and whether or not they were naturalized? And again, you will see NA for naturalized, AL for alien, so they have not started the process at all. And you will see notations for PA that they have filed those first papers, that declaration of intent to get it started, but they haven't finished it yet. And then the column for foreign-born people, especially, a lot of the enumerators would skip this question if the person was born in the United States. But you will see this more often if the person was foreign-born, whether they were able to speak English, and if not, what language did they speak? So the first two people here were both born in Sweden, but they do speak English. The next two people were born in Illinois. The question was left blank. And then this last person I have listed here was born in Sweden, and they only spoke Swedish. The next section of 1910 will cover occupation, education, home ownership, a question about Civil War veterans, whether the person was blind or whether the person was deaf and dumb. And again, these are the terms that are being used in the 1910 census. So we're all the way over here to this right-hand section of the 1910 census. So we have occupation. And for the first time, we're seeing not only their occupation, but a specific industry that they are involved with. So in 1900, this person was probably listed just as a machinist. But now we see that he's a machinist working in a brake shoe. Perhaps, working in a factory making brake shoes, or this is the type of machine that he works on. Whether they were an employer, an employee, or working on their own account. Was this person out of work on the official census date, which was April 15th, 1910? And how many weeks has this person been out of work during 1909? Questions about education. Could this person read? Could this person write? And had this person attended school since September 1st, 1909? Questions about home ownership, similar to what we saw in 1900. So was the home owned or rented? Was it free or mortgaged? In this case, he owned the home and he owned it free. It was a house. And again, the number on the farm schedule, but that really doesn't tell us very much. Now, the last three columns can be a little confusing because what you will often see is what we have here, where it looks like they're recording information, but it's really just coding that the Census Bureau added later as they were compiling their statistics. So take a look at the handwriting. As we can see, this is, pardon me, as we can see that this is a lot lighter than the rest of the handwriting. And also take a look Does this information really make sense for the question it's asking? For example, here in column 30, it's asking whether a veteran of the Union or Confederate Army or Navy. Well, answering 5 to that really doesn't make sense. What you will see in this column is usually UA or UN for Union Army or Union Navy, or CA or CN for Confederate Army or Confederate Navy. And then the last two questions, whether blind in both eyes and whether deaf and dumb. And again, that's a term that's actually used here in the 1910 census. If the answer is yes, they're going to write out yes. They're not going to say 8. So again, just take a common sense approach to the information that you're seeing in these very last columns. Can't stress enough how important it is to read the census carefully, both to get an accurate picture of the family, but also to give you clues for more research. So here we have the James and Ida Guinan household. This is from 1910. And we note that Ida has had 6 children, 4 of whom are still living. Well, here's 3 of them. We have Lawrence, Eunice, and Mabel. But this begs the question, where's the 4th child? So I know, looking at this, I need to do a little bit more research so I can identify that 4th child of Ida's who is still living in 1910. And also remember that this question about relationship just refers to the relationship to the head of household. I've seen a lot of people that would read this household like this. Here we have James and Lida McIntyre and their daughter, Caddy. Well, daughter is just referring to her relationship to James. Let's read this record a little bit more closely. We see that Lida is reported as having no children, living or dead. We also take a look and we see that this is James's 2nd marriage, Lida's 1st, and they've been married 19 years. Caddy, on the other hand, is 33. So what we have here is Caddy isn't Lida's daughter, she's her stepdaughter. So again, make sure that you're looking at all of the information in the census and you're putting all of it together, because it would be pretty easy to just read this and say, oh, Caddy is the daughter of James and Lida. Well, looking at the rest of the information in the census entry, we see that no, Caddy is actually Lida's stepdaughter. And then finally, let's use the 1900 and 1910 censuses together. Here we have the Haven and Emma Smith family in 1910. Now, Haven and Emma have been married for 17 years, and Emma is reported as having 3 children, 2 of whom are still living. So, first marriage for both of them, they've been married 17 years, so they were married about 1893. So somewhere between 1893 and 1910, Emma has lost a child. If we look at the same family in the 1900 census, we see that Emma in 1900 had 1 child, and that child was living. So if we put this information together, we can now narrow down the date of death for that child. Instead of that child dying sometime between 1893 and 1910, we now know that this child who died must have died between 1900 and 1910. And when you're working with a common name like Smith, every bit of information, every clue that you can get, any date that you can narrow down is going to help you with your research. All right, next week on the archives.com live stream, we are going to decipher chicken scratch, tips and tricks for reading old handwriting. As I like to say, old handwriting can be pretty to look at until you try to read it. So that's what we're going to talk about next Wednesday, July the 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, stay connected with archives.com, whether it's on our blog, liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter, and taking a look at some of our other live streams that we've done in the past on our YouTube channel. If you liked this live stream that we've done today on the 1900 and 1910 censuses, a few weeks ago we did a live stream tackling the 1920, 1930, and 1940 censuses, and that's available on our YouTube channel. Also, you might want to subscribe to our YouTube channel and get emails when we upload new videos. So, great way to learn about some genealogy and find some tips and tricks for finding your ancestors. So, until next week, this is Amy Johnson Crow wishing you happy researching.